in place. They just need to make sure that they're using it in the right way. That's going to need a lot of training time. It's going to need encouragement and coaching from supervisors in that. It's going to need to give people the time to make those adjustments in their work area. But it's very different than if I'm going to need a lot of operating budget or capital expenditure to do it. That's going to require different decision makers in it. It's going to require different budget amounts. So we plan that in advance and kind of look through what are we really going to need. Now, every one of the Plan, Do, Check, Act elements occurs in each one of the steps of the process. So I could look at Plan, Do, Check, Act, and I could be like, okay, well, my plan is my risk assessment and root cause analysis, and my do is putting my corrective and preventative actions or controls into place. My check is my follow-up verifications, and act is standardize. But each one of these steps, if I'm doing risk assessments and root causes, I need to plan which risk assessments I'm going to start with. Similar thing with root cause analysis. So I'm going to have my own little Plan, Do, Check, Act just in doing risk assessments. And then I can go down to another level and say, within that job, I'm going to have a Plan, Do, Check, Act for what's happening in that job itself. So you get these at just a variety of layers, and you get them for every step in the process. Think about it as you're planning your process. Think about it both at that bigger level and the smaller level. Now, some of the things in risk assessment that I think you want to look for as you're doing this. You need to have something that gives you consistent results, so that when Rick evaluates a job and when Carly evaluates a job, you're getting the results telling you the same things about it. Next off, I would contend that you want something that's going to be simple to use. If you have to rely on experts to do all of your assessments, it's going to be a slow and expensive process to get all your assessments done. So you want something that can be, doesn't take a 40-hour course to learn how to do, that you can, or more, or, a master's degree or something else that you can, train people to do it in a reasonable, in hours rather than days. Now, it needs to be sensitive enough that you can set priorities. If everything comes back high risk, it's not really helping you determine where do I start. And the results need to be useful for helping you move into what caused these risks to take place, and then also what you're going to do to fix it. So those are all pieces I would look at in any type of risk assessment I was using for it. Now, not just because our company does it, but that's certainly one of the reasons. I'm a big fan of what has been able to happen in the last few years with using, just a single video camera to do a assessment of the risks that are going on in the job. It meets all four of the goals that we talked about there. It gets you consistent results. It's simple to do. It's more accurate than people are. It doesn't mean it never makes errors, but it makes a lot less errors than sending 6 different people out to collect information on a job. As you move into the do phase of it and implementing your improvements, this is a spot where probably the biggest gap I consistently see in ergonomics is the failure to really use the hierarchy of controls. We spend an awful lot of time in the bottom 3 pieces here. So, we do a lot of coaching people or giving new work instructions. We want to put in a new stretching program. We spend a lot of time talking about job rotation or work rest schedules, and we don't get as many solutions in place that help us change the actual risk that's happening within the job, which really only happen up in those top two boxes, the eliminate and the changing the equipment to reduce the risk. As we move from this process of assessing and fixing the jobs, and we move more into the type of metrics that are available, you may hear it a lot of times broken into the idea of leading and lagging metrics, and that's useful, but it's not the end story to it. It's you want a mix of all of these, because if you're only looking at leading and you never stop back to look at where you've been, and whether you're actually accomplishing those goals, you don't know if you have the right leading metrics. So you need to have some of those leading metrics along with also having some of what would be good impact metrics that would really track what's happening with the results that you have. Don't fall into the trap of only having activity measures. Activity measures are fine when you're starting a process, but the longer you've continued on, the more you want to move from just the activity itself to something that's more of an output type measure. So instead of just knowing that we did 10 assessments a month, we want to get into we fixed 30% of our high-risk jobs and brought them to a lower risk. We reduced risk by this amount. Those are still leading indicators, but they move us off of the idea of just having an activity in place for it. So some of the common ones that we'd see in those, the number of workstation improvements implemented, a number of people completing the right levels of training for what they need in their job, and the number or percent of workstations assessed for risk. But if you look and you see, these are great ones when you're starting out, and you can see how these might shift over time. So down the road, you may be looking at the percent of new jobs or workstations that came in at high risk and wanting to drive that down or driving that to zero. Or the number of workstations or jobs that had at least a 10% reduction in their risk score. That becomes a good indicator that it was a meaningful change, not just a change for the sake of change. So with those program elements covered, I'm going to turn it over to Carly to talk about a self-assessment tool and some benchmarking from that tool.
Great, thanks so much, Rick. So like you mentioned, I'm going to talk through the self-assessment tool where we gained some insight into common challenges that companies typically face, and then we'll talk through how to address those challenges. So I specifically want to hone in on the areas that were identified during the analysis of those results of the self-assessment that Rick keeps mentioning here. So just quick backstory about this program self-assessment. We being certified professional ergonomists at Velocity EHS, created a program self-assessment to help our customers quickly assess their current ergonomics plan. There's a QR code here so you can access that self-assessment yourself as well. Take a look at it, use it, whatever. This interactive ergonomics program self-assessment follows the Plan, Do, Check, Act cycle and aligns with ISO 45001 and ANSI Z10. So a lot of those elements that Rick was just talking through, you'll see throughout this self-assessment as well. So it's a really good check to look at whether you're aligning with all of these things that Rick just talked about or not. So it identifies those strengths in your program. It also identifies those gaps in your program and provides some customized recommendations for improvement for those gaps that have been identified as well. So we did a quick analysis, or a pretty thorough analysis actually, of 311 respondents that had done this program self-assessment late last year. And these are a snapshot of what those results were. So the program self-assessment has 6 key content areas in it. There's policy, management review, plan, do, check, and act sections. And within each of those, there's a number of questions that the respondent will indicate, rank themselves on a 0 to 2 within each of those sections. So 0 being they rarely or never do those activities, 1 being they partially or sometimes do those activities, and 2 being they usually or always do those activities. So within each section, the maximum score that can be achieved is a 14. So just wanted to kind of provide that context there. We can see that obviously on average, those scores are somewhat lower than that. And that makes sense because that's where we identify what those gaps are and ways to address those gaps, right? So these are the results from that analysis that we did of those responses. And what we saw, the general trend that we saw here were that sections like policy and do tended to score the highest, which it was really awesome to see that policy scored as high as it did. Rick talked through a lot of those planning components, and a lot of that's worked into the policy and the procedures and all of that. So really great to see that companies are incorporating that part of things into their ergonomics process. The other section being do was also one of the strongest categories. And that wasn't overly surprising. In my experience, we tend to see companies build up a lot of strength in the do part of things. So completing training, reporting discomfort, completing assessments, identifying improvements, all of those things, companies get really, really good at doing. Then as we get further into the PDCA cycle, we start to see more gaps in some areas for improvement there, which is, again, what we're seeing with the general trend in the results here from those self-assessment responses as well. And that's why some of the challenges I'm going to talk through in a little more detail in a bit here are specifically related to the check and act phases of our PDCA cycle. So just a quick example of what one of the key areas of the self-assessment would look like and the responses that we got there. So this was the policy section specifically. So if we remember, that was one of the sections that scored the highest. So we can see here the number of questions within that section. And then, on average, most of the questions were answered by the respondents as them sometimes or usually doing those things. So again, really great to see. The one lagging one that was noted in this section was, do frontline workers review and contribute ideas to the policy? So typically, companies were indicating that they rarely or sometimes do this. And Rick spoke a bit to this as well. Not overly surprising to see this be a bit of a lagging one here, because we tend to get good at involving employees throughout the job improvement process. So like Rick mentioned, we do pretty well having them report those areas of discomfort or identifying hazards and things like that. We do okay with helping them identify countermeasures and things like that. But when it comes to the policy and the planning and the reviewing and all of that, we tend not to include frontline employees as much in those parts of the process. And so it really takes a proactive approach and a clear process and plan in place in order to have them contributing those ideas to the policy and providing that feedback and doing those things. So it's good to note that this is a lagging one and to recognize that we need to be proactive in our approach to include frontline employees throughout the entirety of our process as we can. Okay, so some of the top scoring elements that we found from this analysis of those results are summarized here in this table. I'm not going to go too much in depth on these ones because we really want to focus on what those lagging ones were and those challenges and how we can overcome those. But I do want to highlight specifically this first one here with the people had the highest response rates for doing this was the hierarchy of controls. And a little bit earlier, Rick spoke to the fact that tends to be a gap that we quite frequently see, right? Using the hierarchy of controls, implementing your improvements by prioritizing those engineering controls that are going to eliminate or significantly reduce those MSD risk exposures, that's where we want to be, right? That's where we're going to see our most impactful improvements. And so it's really awesome to see that a lot of companies are indicating that they are in fact following those hierarchy of controls. Now, when it comes to the self-assessment, I do always wish that I could dive a little bit deeper, ask some follow-up questions, have some discussions, because like I said, Rick mentioned that this is a gap we typically see, is that we're focused really in those lower areas of the hierarchy of controls, PPE, job rotation, things like that, right? And so what I tend to find in working with companies is that often they'll maybe misclassify some things within the hierarchy of controls. For example, thinking that, if we implement job rotation, we are in fact, implementing an engineering control. We're reducing that MSD risk exposure. But what we're doing actually is just exposing more of the population to that MSD risk factor, right? So we're not actually following the hierarchy of controls. We're not actually reducing any of those risk factors or eliminating any of those risk factors. Either way, great to see that companies are aware of the hierarchy of controls, feel that they are following the hierarchy of controls. I just wanted to quickly highlight that little difference in where we sometimes see gaps and what actually scored very well in the self-assessment results here. Other things on here, how well people are reducing their MSD risk exposure. So the fact that people are following up, that they're documenting that is terrific. Having a policy in place, having a scope clearly stated in that policy, having an overall or long-term goal that focuses on risk. Again, all really great things when looking at aligning your ergonomics process with ISO 45001. So really good to see companies indicating that they're doing these things. Also up there is including ergonomics and EHS auditing. That's really good to look at the success of your process and track progress and things like that. So really good to see that. And then the final item there having the process review result in follow-up actions. Are they doing something with the results that came out of that assessment of the process? And they are. So just quick highlighting of what those top scoring elements were when we dove a little bit deeper into those responses from the 300 and some responses that we got to the self-assessment. Now getting into some of the good stuff. So some of our lagging ones here are listed in this table. So these were some of the lowest scoring elements overall from those self-assessment responses. And the most lagging one that we have at the top here, and honestly, doesn't overly surprise me that this came out as the most lagging one based on assessments and my experiences in working with companies, is holding the managers accountable for individual ergonomics performance goals. This is a very common challenge. It's very commonly not done. And it's very important that that is something incorporated into their performance evaluation. If, for example, if our goal is that, we're going to do 5 improvements for the year that reduce MSD risk exposure, and that manager for that area, they are in charge of approving the budget, they're in charge of approving the time and things like that for these projects, then if we only get 1 completed for that area for the year, it probably needs to affect their performance evaluation, that they're not achieving those goals that they set out, that were set out for their area, right? And that means having senior leadership that's going to also hold them accountable and that's going to follow through with this. So it is an important element to consider and try to incorporate. Some other lagging items here, establishing program audit criteria. Sorry, so this isn't interesting one, actually, because if we remember back to, I just go back a slide here, one of our top scoring elements was that we were incorporating ergonomics into EHS auditing, right? But now we're saying we didn't necessarily establish what those audit criteria were. That's good to know, right? Here's a really great opportunity to do a better job of focusing on what should be measured on based on what our plan and our policy is and our process is, so that the results we get out of that audit are even better, right? So we're incorporating it in EHS auditing. Awesome. Now let's have some actual audit criteria established so that we can do it even better. Next one's the ROI component of things. I'm going to leave that for a second because I'm going to talk a little bit more in depth about why that might be, why that's important and how we can do that better. But just know that was one of the lagging elements and one of the reasons that I'm going to be speaking to that more thoroughly here. Metrics and KPIs being regularly communicated within the organization. So this was another one of our lagging ones in these responses. If that is lagging for your company and for your organization, that's something that's pretty easily changed, right? Come up with a plan for those communications and ensure that that's done regularly. So long as you're actually tracking those things, right? If you aren't tracking those, though, that's an even bigger problem. A formal process for including lessons learned about ergonomics from existing product lines into new product and equipment design. Again, going to speak to that in a little more depth here in a second, so going to skip over that one for the time being. Having frontline workers reviewing and contributing ideas to the policy. I spoke quite a bit to this when we looked at the policy section there, but within these self-assessment responses, we did identify that this is an issue, and that is something that in our experience we do commonly see as well. So again, just identifying first that's an issue and making a proactive approach to address that. And then the last one, having workplace changes, things like staffing levels, production volumes, resulting in new ergonomics assessments being performed. This one's really a management of change issue here, but when there are workplace changes, there needs to be a clear process in place for, when do those need to be communicated then to have a new ergonomics assessment done. So building that into process to ensure that that's being done when those changes are happening. So those were some of our lagging elements that we identified out of this self-assessment. And as we saw with the overall results as well, the further we get into our PDCA cycle, the more gaps start to come out of that. So I'm going to talk through in a little more detail some of the common challenges specifically in the ACT phase or the sustain it portion of a continuous improvement cycle. Why those things are a challenge. I find usually one of the reasons that these gaps exist in the first place is because people don't really understand why they would want to do it in the first place, and then talk through how we can overcome some of these things as well. Okay, so the first one is evaluating the ROI of improvements. Why would we want to do that in the first place? Well, firstly, we're speaking the language of business managers then, right? They're the ones that are going to be helping define and set the resources for your program. So if we can put that information back in a way that's easily understood for them, that's going to be very helpful. It's also one of the means of verifying the effectiveness of your process. So the degree to which you're achieving results is going to speak well to your program. So we can use the evaluation of the ROI of improvements to help verify that effectiveness of your program itself. Demonstrate value to the organization. Organizations that are most successful with ergonomics have been demonstrating value to their organization. So this is one of the ways that you can do that. And then the final one I'll point out is easier to do the right thing. So certainly, we want to do safety, we want to do ergonomics because it's the right thing to do. And a lot of our leadership supports that this is the right thing to do, right? But it's even easier to support doing the right thing when that right thing is bringing us a return on investment that we can see financially. Right? So that's some of the why side of that. Now, how do we do that? We have a list here on the right-hand side, and one of those is accurately conveying injury savings. And, this is a little bit challenging to do because we can't just say, oh, the average cost of a back injury is, $30,000 a year, and we put a lift table in, so we're saving $30,000 a year. It's a little more complicated than that. We didn't necessarily have one injury per year on this workstation before, so we're not getting totally that level of savings. We'll need to look really at like what a historic rate is, what it looks like across jobs, scale that down a little bit, and not overly inflate what that number is, or we'll get called out on that often, right? Then there's a number of other areas where we can get some really good information to evaluate that ROI and demonstrate that value to the organization. Things like productivity, so looking at time saved, looking at decreased downtime, that can be a big one. Quality, that's always great. Hiring, do I have increased turnover? Do I have a problem finding capable employees because the physical demands of the job are so high that I'm having to rule out people? Absenteeism, and even quantifying something like the engagement that goes with it. These are all great opportunities for evaluating the ROI, for demonstrating value to the organization, verifying effectiveness. These are some ways that you can do that. The next thing I want to talk about is incorporating the lessons learned into the design process. So why would we want to do that in the first place? Most new processes are similar to old processes. For most organizations, when you bring in new equipment or you add a new product, it's usually not a completely and totally different thing than what you've done in the past, right? It's usually some variation or iteration or some growth from other things that you have done previously. So there are things that you can learn so that you don't make the same mistakes, right? Then we have our design guidelines. They're a great starting place, but they aren't always enough to get to the very specific challenges that you faced in the past with that similar process. And so this allows in the design process to know, which of these design guidelines are most important. And it can be a little bit overwhelming for engineers who, ergonomics is not their number one priority. They're also very busy, so it can be a little bit overwhelming for them to get all this information. So if we can just make it simpler for them, that's going to get us better results. And then the whole idea of lessons learned is a familiar concept usually to design engineers. They're already getting this from your quality data and your productivity information. So again, just putting it in that same format just makes it much more accessible for them. Now, how do I do this? The first thing I'd say is, identifying the most similar process. So what do I do now that's most similar to what I'm going to be doing? And then with that process, where are my risk levels within that? Okay, so what's a similar process and where are my risk levels within that? Then find out things that we did, modifications-wise. So post-implementation of that improvement, what modifications did we have to make after the design was done? Because if we just tell the design engineers, we're going to do this same process, they may not go back and look at those modifications that were made. They might just go back to the drawings that they had the last time and go with that, in which case we're reintroducing the risk that we started with in the other similar process and then designed out when we made those modifications. So again, let's just make sure that we make it easy for them to know what these things were that were done with it, and have that documented for them. And then sometimes there's things that we couldn't modify reasonably in that design because we'd need to do an entire redesign. It'd be too costly, whatever it is. So finding out what root causes weren't addressed and documenting those, and most importantly, prioritizing those, right? So if we look at that similar design, what were the 3 most important things from a root cause standpoint that we could address in a new design if we were to do that, right? What are those? And then communicating it, make sure that the design engineers know that. And then similarly to what I was just talking about here, right? when we make those modifications, we're designing out that risk, right? We have this new equipment, this new line, whatever it is that we have gone through, done a risk assessment for, identified the direct causes, prioritized jobs to improve, implemented that improvement, verified that risk reduction by doing another assessment of it, and so on and so forth to make those modifications to reduce the risk, right? Alternatively, if we incorporate those lessons learned into the design prior to bringing in the new piece of equipment or prior to creating the new line, we're going to be able to eliminate a lot of that risk ahead of time more proactively instead of spending a lot of money to make those modifications and those redesigns after the fact, right? If we're designing in ergonomics by utilizing those lessons learned that we've documented from those similar processes, then all those changes that we have to make are being done in CAD or on paper, however it's done, and that's a low cost or no cost solution, right? It's not going to cost us a lot of money to do those things in the design phase versus having to make those modifications after the fact. And then there's the whole idea of standardizing. Okay, so when you've found a fix that's been successful, you've verified that it's effective, and you've verified that the people doing the job, they like it, they accept it, they utilize that improvement on a regular basis. Now it's time to figure out, where can I use the same thing? And some of the challenges for this revolve around awareness and exposure and that kind of thing. And so there's certainly opportunities to kind of treat this or think about this like a marketing activity, right? How can I promote this? Are there posters that I can put up so that people are seeing them? Is there some sort of ad or short video or short clip that I can play on the TV in the lunchroom or another common space? Can I have people talking about it instead of just showing the pictures? Maybe, doing some sort of internal competition among some of the best fixes, just to, spread the word, gain that awareness, gain that exposure. It's also important to determine similar activities, right? So where do I have similar operations, both in my facility, but also in other facilities where I can replicate this fix, have them reap the same benefits that I did from this fix? And then because, my awareness and exposure can help with the people that are pulling for the solution in their area, right? They know it exists, let's bring it over here. But I also want to have processes in place to push that out to areas proactively as well, right? Hey, I know that you've got something that's similar to this, so there might be something here that you can incorporate over in your processes as well, right? Standardize, replicate, build into processes and procedures, train people on it, all very important to the long-term success of your ergonomics process. All right, and then I just want to finish up with basically a couple checklists of what not to do. So I'll go through this pretty quickly here so that we have time for Q&A at the end for sure. But basically, like I said, just a quick checklist of things not to do specifically related to bad habits for ergonomics team members, and then we'll go through some common ergonomics process traps as well. So first thing on the list here, failing to consult the operator as the expert. This is a huge one. It's going to cause you a lot of headaches in so many ways. If you rush through the assessment, don't ask enough questions, don't fully understand the process, you probably won't get to the root of the problem. You might implement changes that don't actually fix things. And you'll probably have issues with engagement and buy-in, right? You're not gonna get their thoughts and opinions and feedback and that on the job. You're gonna miss out on a lot of very valuable information by failing to consult them throughout the process. Insufficient prioritization. Make sure you're prioritizing, and not just the risk scores, but also the source of the risk and how it's impacting business and how it's impacting your stakeholders. If you're just going with your gut all the time and you're not considering things like the risk score or where that risk is coming from or how it might be impacting the business, you might be missing some really good opportunities to make changes that grow the process as a whole, right? And fostering awareness and buy-in and all of those important things as well. Skipping root cause analysis, also a really big one. It's often common to see people watch the job, they identify the risk, and they go, I know how I want to fix this. I have a fantastic solution, and we're going to do this, and it's going to solve all our problems. But they skip the root cause analysis. And so I've seen some really big problems come out of that because they didn't fully understand the process. And so they didn't necessarily tackle the thing that they needed to reduce the risk, right? So they don't understand why they didn't reduce the risk, or they've actually increased the risk, right? So we don't want to skip the root cause analysis. Limited follow-up. If you don't demonstrate risk reduction, it's going to be really hard to show the value of what you're doing in ergonomics, which makes the long-term success of the process a problem. We also can't assume that the solutions just worked. So if you don't do the follow-up analysis, you don't have any proof that you made an improvement and that it was an improvement for the better. You just made a change and you don't know whether that change was bad or that change was good. So we can't just assume that our solutions worked. It also means you can't learn from the past. So we don't want to make the same mistakes twice. I talked about incorporating those lessons learned into design and things like that. If you don't have the data to show that it was or wasn't a mistake, then you have no way of knowing whether it was the right decision to make and whether you need to incorporate that feedback into the future or how to change things or whatever it is. The whole point of what we're talking about here is to follow the plan, do, check, act of a continuous improvement process. And you can't do the act phase or the standardization unless you've actually done the check and verified that what you thought was going to reduce risk did in fact reduce risk. When it comes to process traps, we have gaps in metrics reporting. So I'll just say here, make sure that you're measuring and tracking what's actually important to your stakeholders and that you're aligned with what's important to them. When it comes to how they're getting those reports, right, having it in a format and a location that makes sense. If we're sending it out in a PowerPoint on a quarterly basis and they're not reading that PowerPoint, that's not going to help you. And then relying solely on lagging and/or activity measures. And Rick spoke a lot to this during the common metrics section above. So I'm not going to go too much more into detail there. Incorrect mix of ergonomics team members. I've said this quite a few times now, but frontline employees, they need to be represented. If we don't have them on our team or have a representative on our team, we've lost a huge wealth of information that could be helping you. But then on the flip side, we don't want to over-rely on our frontline workers. They have a lot of responsibilities. They can't own everything. So basically just, making sure that you have that cross-functional input on your team, that everyone's being trained on what it is that they need to be doing, and that they have sufficient time allotted to be doing those activities, and that their manager approves of and is in agreement to give them that time to dedicate to ergonomics. And then just the last two here, failing to incorporate ergonomics into design and purchasing requirements. Again, I talked about this a lot when I talked about incorporating lessons learned into design, so I'm not going to go any more in depth there. And then insufficient auditing of ergonomics. Again, everything that we've kind of talked about here is around continuous improvement. So if you never audit your process, you never know how well it's functioning, and you are going to miss the opportunity to close gaps and to make things better and to have them run more smoothly and to just, get better over time. And that's important, but you'll only know that information if you're regularly auditing your process and if you've established that audit criteria, right? All right. I will hand it over for answering the questions that have come in.
Okay, great. Thank you, Carly and Rick. It looks like we have about 7 minutes left for questions. And just a reminder, if you'd like to ask a question, please type it into the chat window on the right side of your screen and send it to everyone. The first question I have is, how does one calculate ergo injury cost reduction of the program over the years?
Yes, I think Rick shared a really good, hopefully helpful calculator in the chat there. And I'm assuming, I haven't looked at it, Rick, but I'm assuming it's the one, the OSHA one there that will help.
It was one of the participants, but yes.
Perfect, sorry.
So there is definitely that, if you don't have, directly pulling from your own claims data for what you've seen as your injury cost change over time. That works really well when injury costs work really well when you're dealing with it at like an organizational level. When you get down to an individual job level, the fluctuation that can occur from one year to another just due to the kind of random aspect of when the injury actually happens and so forth. That's when it can get a little bit misleading, and I think that's what Carly was alluding to there. Yes, we can repost that link here. All right. Next question.
Okay. The next question I have is, what would you say is the most important leading indicator to focus on when evaluating the effectiveness of your Ergo program?
I can take a stab at this first, Rick, if you want, and then hand it over to you.
Please.
Yeah. So I would say personally that this is heavily dependent on the level of maturity of your organization. I have this conversation a lot with a lot of different companies. I have to ask so many follow-up questions and get a really good understanding of where they are in the level of maturity, right? A company that's just starting out is going to have different leading indicators that they're going to want to evaluate to look at the effectiveness of their Ergo program, and that will change over the years as they increase in maturity. So I think like earlier on, I mean, Rick spoke really well to this in the slides up at the evaluation and common metrics slide as well. But earlier on, typically focusing on things like training and quantifying that current level of risk and how many jobs are high risk and that kind of breakdown, right? And you start to mature in your process, looking at percentage of jobs that then have improvements identified, and how many of those, or percentage of those jobs that are those improvements that are engineering controls versus administrative controls. And then as we get even more and more mature in our program, we start looking, focusing more in on risk reduction metrics, right? And what the percentage risk reduction was with these high risk jobs that we provided implemented improvements for. And then even as we get more mature in our processes and we've started really getting rid of those high risk jobs, and there's not a lot of those high risk jobs existing anymore, starting to hone in on high risk body areas, right? Maybe there's no red jobs anymore, but there's some red body areas that we want to tackle. So sure, I've missed some things, Rick, but I would say there's no one leading KPI I would recommend.
Yeah. If I'm pushed into a corner, I really liked what you emphasized about the stage that you're at. But early on, my most important measure would be tracking the number of improvements of any type that are being made. Because I really hate the trap of just assessing jobs and not getting anything happening. Later, I would shift that to the number of engineering controls. Would probably be my next measure of it. And then after that, I would move to what that's doing to risk. And Carly laid out some good kind of progressive ones that you can look at from how are you impacting risk as well. But that focuses on, all three of those focus on what you're doing about ergonomics in the workplace, not just what have you assessed or what have you trained and those pieces. So, all right.
Cool. I think we just have a couple minutes left. The next question I saw is, what are common ergonomic audit questions or measurements?
I know, Rick, you have lots of experience with auditing.
Yeah, and the first thing, the clear one to start out with is, what you have stated. Are you doing what you're stating in your plan? So when I'm doing an audit of someone's program, one of the things I look at is, how are they doing relative to what they have planned? The other one I then am looking at is really looking at case tracking of what's happened with controls. So as something's been improved, I've got a job, it was assessed. Now let me just randomly pick this job that was a high-risk job and track it through its whole process, almost like you would track a patient through their whole treatment process and see, did we do all the steps? Did we follow up? Did we document the follow-up? Did we really reduce the risk? Are the controls still in place 2 years later when I'm auditing it? Or what's happened with it in the meantime? Is it built into the training? Those are the type of things I do when I'm auditing someone's process.
Okay, great. Thanks, Rick. I think unfortunately that's all the time we have for today. I saw a few more questions. Just wanted to let everyone know that we'll be sharing all questions from today's event with Velocity EHS, so please know that we will pass those along. My thanks to Carly Sorgini and Rick Barker for their presentation, to Velocity EHS for sponsoring today's webinar, and to all of our participants. Please consider joining us on April 15th for our next Synergist event, a product demo focused on PPI samplers for respirable and thoracic particulate sampling. You can register at aiha.webvent.tv. Thanks to everyone again, and have a great day.